Hello, and welcome to Improving's Virtual Lunch and Learn series. Today we have the business case for Cqrs. Speaking will be Devlin Lyles, President of Improving, and Tim Rayburn, Vice President of Consulting. Thank you, and take it away.
Welcome, everybody. I've got to give you a little bit of context around what we're going to be talking about today because it has a bit of a unique origin story. Inside Improving, we oftentimes struggle with the same things that our clients struggle with, from application design to trying to understand the value of different business decisions and technology decisions as it comes to our internal applications. And so as we were having some of these conversations, we realized most of them happen behind closed doors. They happen with a different group of people kind of smattered into different pieces. You'll have the technology design conversation, you'll have the business case presentation, but rarely do you ever have well-informed technologists in business sit down and have the hardline conversations around what's needed, what's the cost, where does it live, what's the value. And so we decided, let's do that. And so we're going to be kicking off a series in which we explore the business case for certain technology buzzwords. Today, that's Command Query Responsibility Segregation, or CQRS, if you're into the buzzword space. And with me is Tim Rayburn, VP of Consulting, one of our eminent technologists. We're not going to have the traditional technology conversation when it comes to this. We're going to be talking about the reasonings for those choices and the business measures by which we can evaluate those choices. Now, Tim and I have pre-agreed that we're going to skip jargon and acronyms. And if I use one, whether it's EBITDA or sales versus revenue, he's going to call me out on it. And if he uses an acronym in the technology space, I'm going to call him out on it to make sure that we're keeping this conversation at a space that we both understand. So let me paint the picture of the situation we're walking into. And this is not a contrived situation. This is something we're experiencing today at Improving. We have 6 different applications. They run different parts of our business, from internal reward systems to community engagement and training, resume management. And they're effectively just input forms and read screens over a database, each of them running independently. They're not wired together in any way. And we're kind of going through and trying to rebuild those into one system. This probably sounds very familiar for a lot of people. We're trying to pull together our lines of business systems into one platform. Now, we've got an MVP prototype of that platform, but we're running into kind of planning for the next stage. And there's been a recommendation that we shift from the MVP approach that we had to CQRS. And this is where I've got some questions for Tim, and we're going to dive into that conversation here. You'll also see sometimes that one of us is going to pivot to talking directly to you as the audience, because there's some pieces to the conversation that are relevant to call out as it gives us meta information about that conversation. And so, Tim, what's the difference? You've recommended this CQRS piece. How's that different from what we've already been doing in our line of business?
So Devlin, when we're looking at a CQRS approach, what it's trying to do is create these departments of data inside your application, where each department is responsible for what it is only responsible for. So when we're looking at tracking of our Improving You activity and from our internal training program, that is handled by that section. And if other pieces need to know about that, if when we do something on Improving You, involvement also needs to know about that, right? Different department, we have an opportunity for them to have an easy way to integrate those disparate areas without meshing them all into one sort of monolithic structure that is doing all of this. It also has a significant advantage to us as we start looking at, again, those integration scenarios beyond the scope of the application itself, right? We're going to make it much easier for us to automatically provision someone onto involvement every time we add them into our HR system, right? If we have the ability to do this sort of thing. And so CQRS makes all those things easier, and as such is totally worth the time and effort that it's going to take to go and throw out what we've done in the MVP and rebuild it with a CQRS model.
So I heard the word integration a couple of different times in that. Is this something we should defer? Like, if I look at down the roadmap, right, to integration, can we wait? Do we have to make this decision now?
Well, this is one of those things that is really best done cohesively throughout the application, and it's going to change how we do everything in regards to how we read and write data. And so I really think that this is one of the things that we just bite the bullet and do here out of the gate, okay? Because it's going to cost us so much more. The more code we write, the more this is going to cost us long term.
So is this all or nothing? Now, to the audience, this is something that happens often, right? This is something that as technologists we run into of we love consistency. We want it to be consistent. But as a business person, consistency is sometimes less valuable. So often you're going to want to ask the question, is it truly all or nothing?
Yeah,
and that's my kickback to Tim. Is this truly all or nothing? We have to change everything.
And no, this isn't all or nothing. If we're truly being honest and having the fourth wall conversation, though that hurts every technologist's soul who just heard me say that. Okay, the reality is that it is absolutely possible to have sections of your application, sections of your domain, if we're in a domain modeled situation, where you've gone through the expense and difficulty of doing CQRS and other areas where you don't bother to at the current time. Okay, so it isn't all or nothing, and it is also, I hinted at it in my answer to you earlier, but this really is the cost of change is going to go up the more code we've written in the future, right? And so if we do need it eventually, every additional line of code we write today makes it more difficult, more expensive to make the change later.
And so at that point, what you're saying is it's fundamentally a cost of change against a speed to market conversation that we're really having.
Correct. In this case, because we have something that works already, and this would be different if we were in a situation of not having a working prototype that did the work at the current time, right? Then yes, this is absolutely a speed to market, go with what we have, right? Versus the broader cost of change in the long run. So, Devlin, no, it's not all or nothing, but you've told me that integration with HR, accounting, and all of our other teams, all of our other systems are on this roadmap, right? Are we more concerned about that, or are we more concerned about getting out right now and getting something into the hands of improvers so they can start using this system?
It's a good question. I will say integration's not part of the MVP definition, right? I don't know what the kind of roadmap to those integrations looks like, but the first step is probably retiring these 6 systems that aren't integrated to each other or to any other system, and really getting that unified experience. So it's probably not part of MVP.
Okay.
So my return to that is, if we don't make it as part of MVP, what's that going to cost me in the future? Like, what am I buying later to defer this now?
So breaking the fourth wall again to the audience. This is the question that you will get asked. Business will ask you this question at some point. And if there are only 3 acceptable words to leave your lips next, okay? Only 3. Those 3 are I don't know. Okay? We're about to frame that conversation. It can't stop at I don't know. But the reality is this is an unknowable thing that we just got asked. how much later is Devlin looking to defer this? How much more code are we going to have written down that road? How many other systems are we going to have be seeking to integrate at that time? How many new areas of this application will we have brought in at that point? That future-looking thing isn't actually knowable, and that's not actually really what Devlin wants. Well, I mean, that's not true. If I suspect that if I could wave a magic wand and actually answer this question, Devlin would be very happy to have a four-figure precise dollar value on this. But we are trying to get a scope, a scale of what the cost is in how it relates. Back to talking to Devlin, not talking about Devlin. So the Devlin, I don't know, because we can't know this. But there are things that are going to factor into that I can tell you, right? It is going to be about, how long are we seeking to defer? How actively is this going to be under development, okay? History has shown us that these 6 applications that we're integrating actually get touched very rarely, right? I mean, one of them is literally running on a database that nobody would have made that choice on, right? But I made that choice a decade ago and no one's changed it, okay? So we know that these are not high turnover systems. So maybe we can start to put bounding context around that. On the other hand, this is 6 applications right now, and 3 years or 5 years ago, this would have been 3 applications that we were integrating, okay? So new scope coming in is a very real part of this as we go forward. So we need to be cognizant of that. That said, I think that there is going to be a significant cost because of the fact that some of the worst parts of doing CQRS is the number of these departments that we talked about that you're reworking. And I think if we look 5 years in the future and say, hey, I'm going to defer this, 5 years out as an example, right? That again, if I use history to inform, right? We don't have 6 departments at that point. We probably have 9 or 10. Because we like new initiatives at improving like nobody's business, okay? And so I think that, and while managing the interconnections between those 6 different departments we have now requires a handful of integration points between them, right? When there are 9 or 10 of them, it's gonna be a jumbled mess by the time we get there. And so it's not linear growth for every additional area that we add. It is probably at least multiplicative growth, if not exponential growth, as we look at that.
That makes sense. And now something else that comes into this, and to the folks in the audience are sitting there listening going, well, that's a really amorphous and kind of scary answer on costs. Keep in mind, in the business realm of evaluating these technology decisions, you're also going to do a little bit of predicting the future. There is technology today that you can buy for $9.10 a month that would have cost hundreds of millions 10 years ago to build. It didn't exist, and it is cheap, easy, and available. So he talked about, and in Tim's answer, he talked about timeline, turnover, additional scope. If we can leave a system stable for a decade, then it's highly likely that a similar system will be purchasable off the market later, right? Integrations, interconnected systems, and all of the supporting pieces of that are getting faster and easier every day. And that's on the backs of Amazon and Google and Microsoft and every other technology service provider who's out there building software as a service to run these integration platforms, right? Implementing something to connect systems used to cost tens of millions to do. And now you can kind of log into your Azure portal and spin up the pieces for a few $100s a month. It's a very different experience than it was. So the answer you're going to get from a technologist is one of what it would take to solve the problem today. You've got to also pair that with where the world is going in that kind of evaluation of whether it's immediately needed when you're talking about defer. Because defer will over time either go up or down, and you really got to kind of gauge what's reasonably likely in the technology space from the business perspective of those offerings. Now, back to Tim. So if we table integration, we take that entirely off the table for future dev. does CQRS have advantages for our current scope? Would it still be your recommendation that we do this work?
So I would say yes. CQRS does have a lot of value when it comes to the integration, but there is value in our current scope as well. The several things that it's very good at enabling, right, include long-running workflows. Okay, we have examples in our current systems that we're integrating in, right, where there is a workflow that takes a significant time, right? Now, we can break those down and not truly represent them as sort of proper workflows in and of themselves, or do a lot of more manual effort to do so, but just the approval process on involvement, other things like that are quarterly things that have review cycles, they have sign off for multiple other people who then have to log into the system and update, right? That keeping track of that state is much easier to do with a CQRS model, where every time a command comes in and it's being used to modify things, I can also have the workflow engine aware that change occurred. Okay. The other one is, like I said, it's really good at isolating the complexity of these internal areas and coordinating work between them. There's value there as well, right? I don't need, if I'm writing the Improving You domain and someone's taken one of our internal training courses, and I want to make sure that involvement is aware that occurred, okay, where we track an employee's activities that they've engaged in for us, right? Without CQRS, then literally in the process, after I've saved this off to save to the database for a successful training course having been executed, I then have to deliberately add a call and say, by the way, add this to the prospective things that involvement needs to be aware of, and go put that business logic that properly belongs to involvement into Improving You because of that. Whereas CQRS gives us a pattern where it says, this was accomplished, notify those who care, and that observer model then allows involvement to respond to that and go, oh, I care about an Improving You course that's completed because I want to give credit to those who attended, right? That model keeps business rules and complexity where they belong, so that if you come back later and say, hey, we have a much better way that we want to run involvement than we have been historically, I don't have to touch every one of these 6 areas that we're bringing together to change the rules by which we run involvement, right? I change involvement only, knowing the 6 other areas are decoupled from them, right? And then finally, when it comes to this, I know obviously one of the things that you would love to be able to do today, right, is, hey, what's the current state of involvement for all of our enterprises? How many points have been submitted on a monthly basis, right? How are they trending towards their goals? Things like that. How many potential points, things like Improving You courses, et cetera, that we know are claimable, have actually been claimed by our employees, right? Potential versus actual. All of these sort of dashboards, search functions, and other things are empowered by the concept of read aggregations, of read projections. They allow us to create very specific data sources meant to very performantly answer those questions. Okay, and some of those
Tim,
things.
I got to stop you. I'm going to invoke our rules.
Oh, did I break a
Read
rule?
Projection. What is that?
Okay, so I think what actually happened here, Devil, is we just hard charged into this without ever actually explaining CQRS and how it works from a technology perspective. So we should probably take a step back and go, let's answer that. Okay, so command query responsibility segregation's purpose is to separate out, when we do a data operation inside of an application, we want to accept that there is a very fundamental difference between things that change the state of the system and things that read the state of the system. Okay, if you're familiar with the concept of CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete. Okay, because don't see, you were going to call me on another acronym, but I went ahead and explained it right away. Okay, a lot of technologists will talk about CRUD applications. Okay, well, the reality is that of those four things, right, one of them is not created equal. Create modifies the state of the system. Updates modify the state of the system. Delete modifies the state of the system. Reads just read things. Okay, and so it's this distinct piece of, if we know that any given thing that's happening in the system is going to change the state of the system, then, and we make that knowledge that state was just changed available to other pieces of the system, then other pieces of the system can react to that. So anytime that we get a new Improving You course that has been recorded, I can make the rest of the system aware a new training course has been completed. That concept can be responded to by the other systems. And one of the things they could do is update their own data. They could modify their own state of the system to go, when a new training course is completed, I now want to make sure there's an entry for everybody in their involvement report, or a potential entry for their involvement report that is ready for them to add. And we've got all the details about when it was taken, who it was taken from, et cetera, all filled in for them. Okay. But the other thing I could do is I can take a copy of that data and manipulate it into the form that most directly answers a dashboard or a query that we know is going to come in. Right? So if I want to be able to full text search all possible courses offered on our internal training course, okay, the best way to do that is not the tabular structure where we keep that course catalog. That might be best offloaded to Solr. That might be best offloaded to some other system who's very good at full text search, okay? And that specific data source just meant to answer that specific type of read, that is what we refer to as a read projection. When we create something whose purpose is to answer a very specific type of question, usually business question, that wants to be asked about these things.
So I want to highlight something that Tim did there. And it's something that technologists often are very bad at, and technology consultants are often very good at if they're fantastic consultants. As the business person, I asked a technology question. The immediate pull as a technologist is to give me a technology answer, because I entered the world. I said, hey, I want to understand that. Like, what's Lucene indexing, or what's a read projection, or what's cloud native in Azure? And then I'm inviting the attack of a wild pack of jargon and going way above my head when it comes to my level of understanding of that system. Now, what Tim heard in that was, there's a fundamental construct of the recommendation that I didn't understand. And so he went, let's back up. And there's a ton of different kind of colloquial ways to do this. All right, let's step back a minute. Let's paint a broader picture. Let's get the 30,000 foot view. We've got a lot of stand-in phrases for that behavior of being able to kind of back out, level set some context. And then notice he gave me examples. He got me practical things that would show up in the application when using that technology. He didn't go in and explain what it would take to implement it. He didn't go into the details around what it would take to accomplish it, where else changes would need to happen, because unfortunately, you can get buried under a pile of details. And so it's something very important in this conversation, is to recognize when you're talking past each other rather than to each other, because that happens often. I may have agreed with that's where we need to go and just didn't understand it, but a deep technical explanation will lead me to 7 more questions, not an answer. So wanted to highlight that, as it gives us a great place to go forward. Now, going back to the kind of question that spurred this line of thinking, right? Tabling integration. Does Cqrs have advantage? One of the advantages you talked about, Tim, was long-running workflows. And as much as that is in our future vision for the product, it's not going to make MVP. And so that advantage is probably less enticing to me. But read and dashboard and search, those are incredibly enticing, because that is a basic fundamental thing we wanted to, as the advantage of pulling these systems together, was the ability to see across those spaces. So that speaks heavily to me. I really dig it. The isolation of complexity, totally dig that. That sounds great too, because, correct me if I'm wrong, I assume that means that introducing change, as long as it doesn't bubble outside those, I think you called them departments, is that makes those cheaper and easier.
Yes. So in the long run, we should be able to get to a lower cost of maintenance, cheaper and easier for these ongoing changes as new rules and new things and new initiatives and new new departments get added into our application here, right? Those are going to be at a reduced cost because of the fact that we will touch less code, right?
Okay. Now, I'm a pure capitalist, which means that I believe that if I'm getting value, I'm probably paying something. And so you just told me I'm going to get value out of this decision. I'm going to get reduced cost of change. I'm going to get all these things. What am I paying for that? Like, what's the cost of implementing CQRS today?
Well, the first thing is, frankly, we're going to take a big portion of what was done in that prototype that works. I mean, I've played with it. It's a great prototype. The guy who wrote it should be complimented getting that done that quickly. That was not me, by the way. But we're going to wind up ripping out a bunch of that because of the fact that it was based on the assumption that we weren't going to do, because they were just following a simple, straightforward pattern to get things off the ground. And we're going to wind up having to isolate and create these various departments. In the process, we're going to expect something a little bit more from the average developer who comes in and has to understand this. It's going to raise an amount of the technical bar of understanding that is required for the next set of developers who are going to work on this. Okay, and as we've had lots of conversations all the time. Unfortunately, smart people are expensive, Devlin.
So notice something here that became a part of the conversation that is oftentimes glazed over. That the cost of skill change is important. Not only are we going to have to teach team members that are working on this application some new piece of something that they may not have experienced in the past, but it also may decrease our onboarding speed because we've introduced a new technology and they've got an additional amount of complexity before they can be up to speed making changes, right? It may also, as Tim alluded to at the end, if it increases the seniority requirement of a team member so significantly, it may actually drastically increase my staffing costs for that project, because normal kind of run-of-the-mill web development is significantly cheaper than specific machine learning or messaging systems or distributed communication or process adjustment or DevSecOps. Like, each of these additional things that I want on my, we'll call it my resume tree, I'm going to hang all the ornaments I want with all the magic buzzwords. Every single ornament becomes more and more expensive because the combination of them gets more and more rare. And so this is something that I experience in running our business all the time, is if 80% of the resume is roughly the same for web development in, let's say, .NET or Java, the cost difference is going to come in the 20%. The things that they have, but the rest of the market typically doesn't. And some of those things are incredibly expensive, right? And there are some skill sets that are just hard to find.
And one of the things that's worthy of noting here, Devlin, is that not everyone's going to have a benefit in regards to this employee cost portion of the conversation, this skill to cost aspect that you definitely happen to benefit from at improving, which is, if I told you that right now we can teach the necessary basics of CQRS to the team who's mostly web devs who are coming in fairly quickly, we'll need one senior on the project. The rest of them can pick it up pretty quickly, right? The The reality is that is setting you up, though, for a future where you now don't have one guy who can do that, but you have 5, right? And that's going to be reflected in their future expected value, is they're now 5 people who are capable, engineers in large distributed systems, okay? For you, it happens to be that that's easy because of the fact that they're consultants, and you're just going to find their next engagement to be something where they're going to more completely use that skill set. But it's not necessarily guaranteed in most businesses that the role that person is in is going to be justify that knowledge and worth in the market of that person long term, right? So how do you deal with that?
Absolutely. And it's a great question of how to deal with that. And there's some complexity to it. Oftentimes when we find clients that feel like they're being held hostage by one of their employees, it is because they have hung all of these kind of specialty needs and drastically reduced the likelihood of finding somebody who could do that same work for a similar price point on the open market. And so these are all business constraints that apply to technology conversations. And my inner technologist, because I grew up in software, although I departed from that a long time ago, my inner technologist hates that answer because technology decisions should be about the technology. They're not. Technology is a vehicle to fuel the business to get to where it needs to go. Business constraints do change technology decisions and should, rightfully so. And so if it's going to make it harder to recruit for, it might be worth spending 10% more development time to have 80% less labor cost. And that's a trade-off that we often don't talk about in these conversations, but we need to. It needs to be an open conversation with the technology team and the business. And once the decision there comes to it, not to resent the fact that a business reason changed a technology decision or vice versa, because technology has transformed the world of business and accelerated and changed the way we operate. It's right that it should go back the other direction as well. So I think that's a really kind of great thing. Now, you mentioned distributed systems and you mentioned kind of interconnections and those kind of things. It sounds like Cqrs is a huge space. Like it's going to make integration easier. It's going to make messaging and workflows and all that easier. Is it really that big, or is there a lot more to what you were saying?
Oh, there is nothing about implementing Cqrs that is going to make turnkey any of the complexities of dealing with our HR system, dealing with our accounting system. It's going to give us a capability to have a clean separation again between these various systems and knowing where the change needs to be made and get us to the point where it can be made in one place, okay? But when we go and decide to, even if we do Cqrs now, when we go to pull in the accounting system, all of the hard questions of how does this how do involvement payouts get run into our accounting system, like those are all business rules that we're not writing today, that are not part of MVP, that are a bunch of additional complexities that we're going to have to answer at that point, right? So it's not, it will make it easier. It will set us up for a situation where there's slightly less cost involved in that experience, but it's not going to make any less involved the business rules that need to be applied at that point and the business workflows that need to be created at that point.
That makes sense. Are there any additional things? Like we're in the stack we're in today, we're taking the approach that we're taking today. We make Cqrs changes. Are there any kind of common patterns that you see going, well, as soon as you do that, here's the next thing, and then the next thing, and then the next thing? Like, is there a normal chain of those practices that we should look at as kind of almost a technology roadmap of what we're budgeting for change in the future, rather than kind of feeling nickeled and dimed as the business of, well, there's constantly a new architectural change I have to make?
Well, so even as we've talked around it today, right, some of the concepts that I've talked about from a department perspective, as we were talking, it was truly actually more broadly the concept of domain-driven design and getting things isolated, right? I've kept it from getting into all the depths of DDD, but there is definitely a tie-in and a commonality to DDD applying alongside these sort of CQRS changes, okay? And as we look out beyond to the greater spend, when we start talking about, I start wanting to integrate with other systems, et cetera, if I'm taking that step, then there's probably a messaging system. There's probably a bus of some sort of communication structure that will be required to allow that intercommunication to happen, right? Because if we don't create a way for things to be communicating that isn't strictly point to point, then we wind up with recreating our coupling problem that we were talking about now simply as I have to notify the accounting system explicitly because I have to, as the originator of the change from CQRS, know who needs to care, right? Versus having that decentralized from me on something like a publication and subscribe model so that I'm just a publisher of a magazine, so to speak, of here's the latest involvement report that's been summarized for a quarter. And that quarterly subscription, not the daily subscription of what happened on involvement, but on the quarterly level, that's going to now be received by our accounting system, who cares about the dollar values that are associated with that and making sure that it's appropriately reflected. So I think as we look forward, yes, a messaging system, I have certainly got recommendations around what that messaging system should be, but I think you told me they're not MVP, and so I don't really want to make that choice today because of the fact that if I can make that choice in the future, I'm going to have more choices and cheaper options and better pricing most likely in the future than I would today.
Definitely makes sense. And so as we transition to kind of this last point, I want to highlight what happened here. We talked about future roadmap items and pending technology decisions. Tagging these into our backlog gives us both the reminder of revisiting those conversations. Like, hey, this epic or this set of features, this is the conversation. These are the things that would cause us to look at an event bus, or this kind of outcome would cause us to look at domain-driven design. And now, as we transition kind of into the wrap-up of this conversation, which I've definitely enjoyed kind of digging through all of the different pieces to it, we're going to go into something that we haven't done up till now, which is just blanket advice. We're going to add something to a conversation that we almost never see, but is one of the biggest pain points for both business and technologists in coming to these conversations. And that is, when and how do we agree to revisit this conversation in the future? What are key things that might change to cause us to relitigate this conversation? Because oftentimes, if I disagree but feel bullied by the technology and the technology team, they're forcing their will, I'll constantly be pushing back and going, well, we're over budget because of your event bus, or we're over budget, or we're late because of your changes, right? Tech debt or refactoring. There's tons of words I can throw at this without truly understanding what they are because I resent where we're at and don't have an effective way to re-engage the conversation.
And
Tim,
likewise,
do technologists see that kind of thing?
Yeah, and likewise, I was going to say, turned around the other way, right? When we go in and if the outcome of the decision is not in the favor of the technology we were advocating, right? Then very often we as technologists will look at every little thing that could have been a little bit easier if we had been on that new technology that we had been suggesting, and immediately want to reopen the conversation to go, see, this is again something that could have been easier, and again something that could have been easier. And the reality is that bringing that up over and over and over again, like, it just isn't helpful to the long-term relationship, right? I'll be the person who will mention, this is like the toddler who's like, but I don't wanna, and it's like, do this. They'll put away one toy. Okay, I cleaned up. No, you didn't, right? Like the definition of constantly having to rehab the conversation, right? We need to know when when it is time to revisit this. And so if we're in the situation like this, we need to explicitly have that portion of the conversation. So before we got into actually making a decision, we wanted to pause and say, getting out of the decision, not just the decision, but also how to re-engage and when is the appropriate point to re-engage on these things, and to potentially reevaluate, maybe not in all this depth, but to at least have the checkpoint. Is this the point where we reinvestigate this? Is worthy of making sure that we do as we go into this process. So Devlin, at the end of the day, you're the business guy, it's your call. Are we doing CQRS on this or aren't we?
I don't think so for MVP globally. However, for search and dashboard, I think we probably carved that off, even though it'll put us in a little bit of that Frankenstein that you had talked about. That's probably the direction we're going to go. So at what point do we look at a broader implementation of CQRS?
So I think that the first one is obviously, as soon as integrations with other systems are back on the table, I think this has to be revisited at that point. Likewise, we talked about it earlier, but long-running workflows. If we start trying to properly implement the review cycle as a long-running workflow for involvement, that's going to be something where it's worth revisiting this conversation at that point. At the very least, if not holistically for the whole system at that point, but certainly fully within involvement at that point, inside the involvement domain at that point. And then those are the two biggies that just stand out to me, right? That are obvious needs to come back and reopen this discussion. Does that sound fair?
It does. Now, something I want to highlight, it's not pertinent to our conversation because we're talking about 1,600 people. But another big point would be, are there scale limits in the decision we just made, right? Because if I'm planning on growing the business 40x next year, then there's very likely a point in which the technology recommendation must change. And that's valid. It doesn't mean they did it wrong the first time. It doesn't mean that we should have done it better. It just means there are different approaches when you're building high throughput bus systems than there are when you're building sports cars. Just different decisions.
Yep.
And so it's one that Tim didn't bring up because it's not pertinent to our example, but it is definitely a pertinent conversation to have, talking about what are the business goals in growing our customer throughput, because that's another place where CQRS, especially when you're talking about a web front end, becomes highly performant on the read side of things. And so as we continue this conversation, keep in mind, we did leave out the one that isn't pertinent to us, but maybe incredibly pertinent to you.
And it is worthy of note that type of information is something that we also encourage, not just happening at this portion of the conversation, right? When you're dealing with starting out a project as a whole, talk about performance, talk about scale, because they are aspects of your system that are oftentimes more important than, sorry, business guys, more important than your new feature, right? Than that cool new thing you want to do, right? Like, if you do the cool new thing, but decrease Amazon's front page load, right, to taking 2.5 seconds each time, not worth it, not even close. And by the way, that Amazon has the metrics to back that up, okay, to explain why that isn't worth the trade-off. And so the best teams who have done this talk about that, measure it, and expect it from the outset. I remember working with a team that Devlin and I both worked with who had this new system that we're developing has to handle 10 times our current load, right? Because we're planning for a future state where we are expecting that we are going to continue to grow, and this project is only worth the investment that we're making at the current time if we can grow to 10 times our current business without having to be concerned about performance. And that was remarkable clarity, remarkable ability to start taking technology decisions and just going, nope, we can't possibly do that because it won't scale to where we need it to scale, right? Have those conversations up front, but also make sure you mention them here if we're making a choice that could not hit our medium-term goals for performance and scalability, but not our long-term goals, know that then gets us to a situation where we would need to revisit this conversation.
Absolutely. And the only word of caution from the business guy side of this is that can't be in milliseconds of database calls. Like, page load time is awesome, but the product owner at Amazon doesn't care about the page load time just to see it load really quickly. Cares about the fact that that's going to cause somebody to go to a different page or to search a different place or to go over to a different website to order their thing. It is about the business outcome that page load, that performance, that scalability will cause. And as technologists, speaking in those terms creates trust that you understand the business we're in and are working towards the commonly defined good that we're aiming for. So lastly, we want to give a chance for anybody to ask any questions you might have. I have one that is primarily targeted to the technology side of this to seed us off with, while you can go to the QA portion of the interface if you'd like to ask some questions. But Tim, what are some mistakes that business people make in having this conversation that you have seen just go horribly sideways?
So there's so many ways that these conversations can go sideways. I would say a common one, unfortunately, right, is to make the blunder of making the turning away from your own business case, revenue-backed, metric-backed things, to in any way making it a personal attack against the technologist or the history of the team, right? Like, this is about trying to solve a problem, right? And making the right technology decision isn't necessarily immediately about what that team has done or the last time you told me this was going to do, and so on and so forth. Those trust issues need to be dealt with, but they're not this conversation, right? And they just are going to emotionally charge up both sides in a way where it proves that there's a different conversation needs to happen at that point that is not this conversation, before we can be having the rational conversation that we're trying to go here. And if we're going to ratchet up emotion inside of this conversation, nothing productive's coming out of that.
It's a phenomenal answer, and so I'm gonna give you the space to ask the other side of this while Michael collates and kind of collects those things that we might be able to answer here in just a minute.
Yeah. So Devlin, how does it go wrong from a business perspective, right? How does this stumble for
Absolutely
commonly for business?
So I have been lucky enough in my career to be on both sides of this conversation. And what I have learned is the most common mistake I made personally, and I see tons of other technologists make, is believing that the technology is the conversation, believing that it is the end, not a mean. There are times in which the right technology answer is a tablet and a pencil. Not a digital tablet, like a sheets of paper tablet and a pencil, right? We had a conversation once where the client was asking for an application to optimize one of their processes, and it was going to save them 3 hours a week of one person's time, but cost $140,000 to develop. And that $140,000 had a 30-year payback based on the salary of the person they were saving time. It's like, just stop. Like, don't do this. I wouldn't spend my money this way. You shouldn't spend your money this way, because the technology isn't the conversation you're having, right? It's not about whether the technologist is right or I'm right as the business person. And so those conversations have a tendency to get attributed via language, via not actively listening, to either we're talking about a technology or we're talking about people. It's like, no, we're talking about problems and solutions. None of those have names. Like, none of those have birthdays. Like, we're not celebrating a retirement party for a problem. Like, we're going into it and really trying to talk about the best case future for whatever that problem or whatever that kind of solution looks like, and looking at them and weighing their advantages and their disadvantages. And I think that context gets lost often in the need to be right, the need to win the design argument, right? And so I think that's probably the most common one I personally stepped on, and I see technologists step on all the time.
No, that's an excellent point. I would also add in that when we're looking at things, even in the business side of technology, we have a tendency to look at the development cost, right? And okay, I've got a fairly good idea of what long-term, quote unquote, cost of this system is, right? But systems tend to have one of two ways that they go long-term, right? The first is, okay, I create this line of business system and it allows me to have better visibility, things like that. And so that's great. And the ease of effort to do what was previously a manual process on the business results in the business complexity increasing. And so the application's complexity increases over time to the point where there is no concept of stepping back to a manual process, because the process now is not capable of being done by humans, right? And so this is one of those things where we become hyper dependent, and it becomes that this is not a quote unquote long term. There's no full retirement of this system ever. We are just always going to need this. The great example of this one is email. Like, frankly, it's just a given. There's no business today that doesn't have an email address for their various employees. It has become so baked in, it's just table stakes. You can't run a business without it, right? Likewise, web presence, things like that. They've become ubiquitous, and as such, their cost has to be baked in. Now, hopefully, as Devlin mentioned earlier, their cost has decreased over time because they've gone through that transition. But that's only one of the two forms that the system takes. The other one is it gets solved so completely and yet doesn't start growing that we just forget how that was ever done, right? And I have worked with multiple businesses who have a system that does a very important job for them that they just literally don't know the business rules for anymore. All of the whys and wherefores of how that was done were codified at one point 20 years ago, and we haven't touched it since then. But that's not how technology works. You can't have a system that you just don't touch for 20 years without it becoming a security problem, without it becoming a performance issue. Like, there are going to be things that need to be revisited in that. And so again, the hyper long term of that system winds up being different, and you can't go back to a different way of doing it because you don't know how it's done anymore organizationally, right? And so those are significant challenges. But Michael, did we have any actual questions come in through the Q&A feature?
I do have a question for you. And you will both have to answer to this. Do you think your decision is actually to have your foot half in the door on CQRS? And if so, is that putting increased burden on the technology team to deal with the short and long-term consequences from a technical perspective? And also, is that punting the harder question from the business to the technical because you couldn't commit to either?
Okay, Dev, you get this one first because there's an improver listening to this talk who's on the team. Okay, go ahead.
So the answer is yes. We've chosen to be half in one and half on the other. We are riding two horses, 1 foot in each saddle. Ultimately, we are trying to punt the decision. We're trying to punt the decision until the revenue and the business value is produced by a unified MVP to the point where it justifies the additional cost of that piece. Now, to get to business value and internal, rate of return, whatever measure you want to use as a business, yes, we're going to need to make sacrifices. Same way a startup makes sacrifices when they're getting an MVP out to production or a minimally marketable product or a beta product. The folks that are using that aren't going to have the best experience. They're not going to have the experience that if it succeeds, they'll have in 3 years. but they will have an experience, whereas today they don't have one. And so that's what we're trying to do. And it's always going to be messy, right? We are punting, we are raising that bar of complexity. Now, when you're building a proof of concept or you're building a replacement system, that raised bar of complexity is part of getting to MVP. But it is incredibly dangerous as a business person to throw down the hard line, draw the line in the sand, stick to your guns mandate. It must be feature parity to go live. And that's what we're getting away from. And so while it's not a perfect answer, we are staying away from the war zone of feature parity being an absolute requirement because our current systems are continuing to evolve. Now, for context, internally, we've slowed that, but we haven't been able to stop it because there's still break fix and those kind of things. And so we're trying to catch up with a running car while building a new car beside it, which means we're going to make trade-offs. We're going to make sacrifices. Now, by making the half-in decision, I'm signing up for, at some point, reducing that complexity or the maintenance burden of having both, right? Now, I want the value for search and for dashboards and for reporting that read projections give me. Thanks for the term there, Tim. But I don't know that I want the rewrite length of time to delay MVP. And so that's the trade, is I'm taking complexity to hit an earlier MVP date.
And it is worthy of note that there are that time to market, right? Like, it is super important to realize, right, that there is so much good value currently locked up in the workable prototype, right? That honestly, I want in the hands of improvers, right? I want them to start experiencing that new version of the system, right? And so it certainly resonates to me as an improver that yeah, like, let's take the portion of this that is, it's going to be slightly more complicated for the dozen people who at most are going to be touching this code base and making these modifications, right? To move towards a much faster 1,600 improvers get a benefited system that is unified, that really allows us to then start moving forward in amazing ways. Because I can tell you, we're, again, 4 or 5 years easy into conversation after conversation after conversation internally, right? Where it's, if only improving knew about involvement, or if only involvement knew about accounting, or yada yada yada. And so any step closer in that direction also makes things better for improvers, right? And that benefit experienced by a better system is a lot of business value. And I realize I'm making Devlin's case at the current time, but there is a lot
the hard
of
conversation. It's one of the hardest things for us to accept, both as business folks and as technologists, is that it's never going to be everything we want. It's because time continues to progress linearly, if you believe in that. The progression of time means that we're going to have to make trade-offs, and it means that we're never going to have a perfect answer, and that tomorrow's answer is going to be different than today's. But I think it gets us to a great wrapping point, which is that the conversation's never done. As long as you've got a well-balanced conversation, you'll notice we had both perspectives in the room. We also had stakeholders that introduce ideas into that, and I think that's very valuable. But the bigger the room where you're discussing these things get, the far less likely you are to get to a decision. And so as kind of we wrap this, notice you want just enough of the perspectives in the room to come to a well-balanced and well-informed decision, but you don't want to invite an 18,000 customer base to drive that decision-making. They need to inform it. They're a stakeholder, their data, their metrics into it. But at the end of the day, you've got to have a small group of people and one clear product owner to drive those things forward.
Yeah.
We
need to know who can make that decision. If it's beyond 2, I knew Devlin was making this call, right, in this situation. But if it gets to more people, know who the decision maker is, because it's when they've been convinced, that's when the conversation is over for right now.
Absolutely. And I greatly appreciate everybody spending the time. Tim, thank you for kind of representing and deconstructing the technologist opinion as a part of this conversation. Michael, thank you for producing. Come back and visit us. We're going to be having one of these conversations kind of each month and tearing apart the different buzzwords in the evaluation conversation, putting together the business case for technology. Have a great afternoon. That's all we've got.